The media landscape is changing and changing fast, and we're all going to be impacted by this in one way or another. The Tribune Company, they're selling its massive collection of storied newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune, the New York Daily News, the Baltimore Sun, and a slew of other papers. In major cities, the buyer, a hedge fund called Alden Global Capital, those papers, they will remain in print, at least as of now, but journalists there, they're livid. Some calling Alden, quote, someone who does not care about journalism, and a lot of other things I can't say on TV. Alden's got a long history of buying distressed newspapers, slashing staff, selling physical property, and shifting money away to other assets. The other big deal to tell you about, the digital broadcasting world, where you have AT&T merging its content unit, Warner Media, with Discovery. It's going to put channels like HBO, CNN, TBS, and others under the same roof as Discovery. The Food Network, Oprah, and others. Their streaming services will also merge. New company says it has every intention of leaving CNN, a Warner Media property, more or less on its own. But all of this consolidation in both print and broadcast is putting more and more content in fewer and fewer hands. I want to bring my next guest to discuss that and more. Edmund Lee, he covers the media industry for the New York Times. And, you know, this is certainly not a news story, Edmund, about papers dying slow deaths. Is certainly at least ones that cover a particular market. But it seems that with the exception of a few white knights, especially with some of the more, national papers, if you will, it's the same story, rinse and repeat, and the consequences never seem to be good.
Yeah, and I think in this particular case with Tribune, the Alden hedge fund is famous for basically coming in and slashing costs, reaping all the sort of the cash benefits, and then just not really investing in the journalism itself. I mean, what's interesting or a little bit ironic is that all these local papers that are sort of part of this Tribune group, a lot of them are actually profitable. They still generate a decent amount of cash, and I think that's why it's attracted hedge funds like Alden. And they look at the business and they're like, well, we can even cut more costs and extract more cash. The problem is, of course, is that every year there's less cash coming in. So once that sort of cash is drained, once it's sort of lived its usefulness, you really worry about what's going to happen to the future of these papers. And I think that's the concern from a lot of the journalists at these papers, given the history of these types of funds and Alden in particular. That there's no real investment in this type of news, because specifically local news, because it just requires so much money up front, and the model still has to change, but no one's really cracked it, at least not on the local level.
You know, I mean, it's, I was talking about this a little yesterday. I think for the casual consumer, they think, oh, this is a small town newspapers. Denver Post, I mean, you're talking top 10 markets in this country that are down to one paper of record, and sometimes they're completely digital or not, at least in print, for 7 days a week. And I'm not a dinosaur here who, or maybe I am, but and that I need to consume it by holding it. But I mean, I gave a story yesterday. I used to go up to Albany to cover, some state of the states or whatever, where you'd have to fight to get a seat in the press briefing room when it was time to file. You look around, you're lucky if you see one or two other people, and the consequences for covering and holding to account the major stakeholders right now. I mean, few, if any, people are left. You can't just go to the Times or the LA Times or the Washington Post or the Journal. There's got to be more than that.
And that, you make a great point. And, studies have shown that when local news operations are decimated, when there's just less coverage, fewer people in that area participate in political process, meaning just they don't vote as much, or they're not as aware of sort of municipal issues that might directly affect them. So, and, as well as, say, the New York Times is doing, or the Washington Post, it's actually not big enough to cover everything, to cover all these different locations. In the Times, the Post, the LA Times, they've actually gotten big by being really more national papers, as opposed to what it used to be once upon a time, where the Times was really a local paper with some national coverage, and the Post was really a local paper, in the nation's capital. So that had its sort of a national footprint that way. But they're all pivoting. We're all sort of kind of remaking ourselves to be more of a national presence, and that's great on that front. But on the local front, it hasn't been great at all, and no one's really investing, or there are very few people willing to do that.
You know, I mentioned on the digital side the deal with Discovery and AT&T, and there's a lot of layers to it. But do you think the consumer looks at this and says, you know, terrific, it's like an alphabet soup with so many different apps and all the things I got to stream? Or should they be concerned that the further consolidation of content across a lot of different, not just platforms, but types of content, we're going to look back and say, hey, was anybody minding the story here? We let too few people have too much power.
That's a fair concern. And I think that was sort of the traditional kind of antitrust sort of lens, right? When you have these big media companies merging. I'm going to offer a slight counterpoint to that, though. I think one of the big reasons why you're seeing these big mergers happening with media companies is that they're actually not quite big enough, ironically, relative to Facebook or YouTube, Google, or Amazon, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok. In other words, the marketplace has actually been redefined in a lot of ways, which is to say that as a consumer of news, as a consumer of just entertainment and content, people are getting as much from YouTube or TikTok as they are from CNN or HBO. So because of that added competition, the sort of traditional linear cable television networks are actually losing a lot of customers. And so they're seeing the need to sort of team up with each other, so to speak, not necessarily to sort of beat the other media company, but to beat Facebook, to beat YouTube. And that's where the real competition is. And I think from a regulatory standpoint, that's a big question. How will the Biden administration view these mergers? Will it be anti-competitive, or will they say, like, actually, that might be a good sort of check against Facebook? And we all have known what problems Facebook has posed for democracy and for information, or misinformation, that is.
Edmund Lee, I really appreciate you bouncing around on these topics with me. Thank you so much.
Anytime. It was fun.
All right, when we come back, a few minutes ago, I showed you just how anti-Semitism is on the rise here stateside, ever since fighting flared up between Israelis and Palestinians just a couple weeks ago. Now, after the break, we're going to speak with an author of a book about the Holocaust that's unfortunately becoming more and more relevant as the days go by.